Hello, I'm Morris Kochanski, Wilderness Living Skills and Survival Instructor. Today's topic is going to be about the knives that played a very direct role in my life as an instructor, as a surveyor, and what have you. Now, I'm probably missing 2 or 3 knives out of the lot, but I'm fortunate enough to have a representative sample that I can say something about. One knife that somehow goes back is a knife I had that I think it was a Boy Scout knife. Looked very much like this. I lost it long ago. I probably in my life have lost a couple dozen knives at least, just in my recollection. But it looked very much like this. It had a wooden handle, and it had a metal guard. It wasn't very big, and it had the Scout logo on the sheath. Now this one doesn't, but that one goes back in my memory. This, incidentally, when you give kids a choice between choosing a very well worked out functional knife and this one, they'll always pick this one. It's a curious thing. I had a bunch of these knives for sale, and the kids bought out this knife first before the less expensive knife. Now the other knife that I recall a great deal is this one. I was born in 1940. This is the United States Marine knife, maybe, or whatever. It's got a 10-centimeter blade. And these were very commonly available through the surplus process. So in 1940, being born in 1940, in 1949, 1950, I'd be 9, 10 years old. There were a lot of these handles and these blades laying around the farmyard because we could buy them so cheaply. And of course, you're going to have to throw a knife at a log wall, at the barn wall, and the knives would break right there. It was a curious thing that a knife is as hefty looking and meant to do such heavy work as a soldier had the vulnerability that it was made, and in the manufacturing process they did not provide enough strength right in there in the transition from the blade to the knife. But this knife was sort of a knife that held the attention of a 10-year-old quite readily. Another knife that was also available at the same time, and more so once you learned about it in more like high school years and so on, was the Fairbairn Sykes Commando knife. Now this knife in particular turned out to be a superior filleting knife. I would say that we would fillet jackfish and everything with this type of configuration, and we would consider it, if not a superior, an excellent filleting knife. But this knife has a whole book devoted to its design and its usage. And because it's sharpened on both sides, it's probably an illegal knife. If you bought a knife like this, I'm sure the customs people in Canada would allow you to come in as I had them check my knife, because they of course see it. But if I try to buy knives like this, I'm pretty sure they would be confiscated. The handle was made out of some kind of a very heavy metal alloy, and it could be thrown with considerable power if you chose to. Because there's one thing that young people and knives is the irresistible urge to throw them for, that's what you do with throwing knives, I guess. But at any rate, somewhere in my elementary, high school days, we were familiar with that knife. The other knife family in this wooden handle version, and they came in the red-handled version came later, but the normal wood version that looked like the wood on this knife here was readily available, commonly available in all the hardware stores. There really wasn't sporting goods stores as such that I recall. Now this knife might be a size and one slightly bigger, but I didn't dig up the knives here. This one with the orange handle was actual Swedish Army issue. And you would say that like all things that the Swedes touch, here is a knife that you might say that's neither too big nor too small. This one is very close, but this size of knife was favored by the girls. They have smaller hands, and you find that the knife blade seems to be connected to the knife handle. So if you got a big blade, you get a big handle. But at any rate, this one here is the universally neither too big nor too small knife with a functional length of blade. And this one is slightly smaller, but not that much different with regard to functional. But being a little smaller, and the next knife smaller again, was favored by the girls in the hundreds and hundreds of girls that took outdoor ed. Now, while we're taking outdoor ed, the very first knife that came into use looks something like this. Now, this is a knife all of us boys, definitely in the elementary school, we'd always have one of these or something that looks similar. They're very inexpensive. So if you lost it, you could afford to buy a new one, because this knife, as it is, cost $1 or around there, while back in the early 70s in particular, that we found that our notion about using knives seemed to be focused more on whittling, we might say, so we thought, hey, that knife would be for whittling. It also turns out that this is a Sheffield steel that sparks, has a superior spark when trying to light fire the flint and steel using the back of the knife, so you could kill two birds with one stone. The students would have a relatively inexpensive knife, and the type of crafting and all the activities that we were engaged in generally didn't really go beyond having to use something this small. Then we discovered that there was the Open L. Again, the Open L is very sparky and a relatively inexpensive knife because of the construction. Here you got spring steel and whatever. Here you have something slightly different. When you open the knife, then you hold the blade from shutting by turning a ring. So for a number of years, this became the knife that was supplied to the programs for quite a while. We got very familiar with its use. This knife is one that I used as a surveyor. So from probably my early 20s for the next 10 years, this is about the only knife I carried. And if there was any knife I lost a great deal, it was this one, because you'd carry it in your jeans back pocket, and one day the knife is gone, you find the stitching is gone in the back pocket. Now this is another highly respected knife. It's Schrade, and why it had the two rather similar blades, well, we rarely used one or the other, but that's the knife that I figured it was close enough to being a hunting knife that it would be both much like a hunting knife. But the big problem with these knives is that unless you have a lock blade, they close on your fingers. This knife as well. So you learn very quickly that you learn to use these knives with the hand being open, and whether they have a lock blade mechanism on it or not, because we found we cannot trust the lock blade mechanisms, because we often would have them close on us. So when the knife is used in a certain way, where you're drilling or making a hole, you can find it accidentally can close onto your fingers. So you remedy that by always holding the knife in such a way that it can close without that. Then I discovered that as I kept buying these, a cheaper knife, lighter, that only had one simple blade, much lighter, it's probably half the weight, and I went through a number of these. This was also had the advantage that it had a lock blade, and this is a German make, Heinkel, no, Friedrich Herder and Sons, Solingen, Germany. And we found that Solingen, like Sheffield and like Mora, were the terms that you could expect were steels that you were very happy with. Now, as I became more refined, there happened to be a display case found in almost all hardware stores, because the Boker people were pretty aggressive in presenting and advertising their knives. And the lock blade again, which here you can see the lock blade, WD-40 and so on, lost a lot of those too. So I found that the black knives, the dark colored knives, they're rather invisible when they fall on the ground and in the grass. But this one is like to me, compared to many of the other knives, I figured it was very, very meticulously crafted, and I was quite partial to it, and I found that I could put a razor's edge on that generally. Here I see a little bit of a pin showing. This is always a problem with the cheaper knives. These in particular, we often had to replace the pin and re-drill it. Some students got to the point they would pry off the outer handles, drill the hole, put a more substantial pin in there, and then put nice wooden, I think these are called bolsters. It's common for these, no, that's not the right term, these things to fall off. But at any rate, there's a knife that I was very familiar with. Well, on one occasion, for a couple of years, this was the knife that we used, which is not much different from this one. And that was because I went into a hardware store, and this was actually in Lethbridge, and they had these on for sale. And they were so inexpensive, and I was so impressed that I liked the design that I think I bought about 300. And then I resold them to the students. And I would say that that in the sense of packing a minimal knife in a survival kit, I would feel comfortable that this knife would do an awful lot. But the benefit is that you have something that takes so little space and still allows you to carve and to make feathers and to do all the things that you need to do. This is something that is at minimal obtrusiveness and so on. So as a pocket knife, I would highly recommend that. But as a belt knife, I would say that the two knives, the backup and the one that is extremely well designed for working wood. Now this knife, I mentioned earlier talk, is the knife that we evolved. There was a situation where the students in the RCAF Survival, Department of National Defense Survival School, were issued and reissued knives. Well, the situation is the previous user can abuse the knife by digging in the ground and doing all kinds of things. And with the knife they issued, the steel was so hard that there was no real feasible means to be able to put a functional edge back on the knife. So instead, we made large numbers of these during our spare time, and we would lend these to the students who didn't have the forethought to bring their own knife. Because if they had not bring their own knife, they were stuck with the issued knife, and it was only probably functionally useful because there's no way you could make feathers. Another knife that's come up that came later, which I was partial to whenever I could get it, was this one. And this plastic handles replaced the wooden handles, making them less expensive. And the situation is that they would come with a guard. And if the guard is there and you don't want the guard, you can grind it off. But many people would prefer to leave out the guard. But generally, as students became more experienced, they realized that they prefer to remove the guard because it interfered a great deal with your quick and easy method of utilizing the knife. And the blade here is quite narrow, but it still has a Scandi drive, and we found we don't need to have such a broad blade. And this gave you tighter curvatures and carving and so on. And then finally the skookum, a knife that one of the students listened to everything I said, and he became a knife maker. And he came out with a knife called the skookum. Whitefish, Montana. Rod. What's Rod's last name? Garcia. Rod Garcia. Anyway, but that's a story in itself. Anyway, these are the knives that I encountered. Now, I have class sets of this knife, or similar to this. there's about 30 in the class set. So there's 3 class sets, 3 that are ready to be used, 3 that are still almost usable and should be sharpened, and 30 and 30 that are require a great deal of work. And when you once every few years you sit down and sharpen all 100 of them. So when I put all the knives in my possession, and I don't really go out of my way to buy knives. Most of the knives are given to me. I can barely lift that bag. I can lift it off, but barely. That's how many knives. So you're looking at about 150 pounds of knives. There are a lot of knives, but these are the ones that had played a role, and that role was significant and important.